Okay. All right, thank you all for coming. How many of you are from the Washington area? I'm just curious. Okay. How many of you are from outside of Washington? Okay. How many of you are capitalists? Any capitalists? How many anti-capitalists here? All right, how many people came because you think you're going to learn how to invest in Asia? Anybody? Okay. So
that's why you came, isn't it?
Right. I should put that up. Okay. So we have two very distinguished authors here and individuals, and I know them both. And let me just introduce them briefly, and we'll get into a little bit about their background in the conversation. So to my immediate right is the author of this book, Can American Capitalism Survive? By Steve Pearlstein. Steve is a native of Boston area, and he went to college at Trinity, and then later did a number of things in the journalistic area, and actually started his own magazine in Boston, the Boston Observer, but worked at the Washington Post for many, many years, and he still is a columnist for the Washington Post. And for his writing on the 2008 financial crisis, he won the Pulitzer Prize. He is now the Robinson Professor of Public Affairs at George Mason University, in addition to writing for the Washington Post, in addition to writing books. So we'll talk about your book in one moment.
Thanks.
And to his right is Parag Khanna, who actually lives not in Washington, D.C. area, but in Singapore. And he flew all the way from Singapore for this event, more or less, right? Which is very good, okay? His book is The Future is Asian. He grew up in many different places around the world, but Dubai, among other places, and lived in the United States. He's a graduate of Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, where he got his bachelor's and master's degrees, and then his PhD at the London School of Economics. And he has written many books about, I'd say, global affairs. He now is the head of a firm he started called Future Map, which gives a lot of strategic advice to companies and other organizations. And he is a person who Esquire magazine said not too long ago that he was one of the 75 most important people in the 21st century. That's a pretty impressive
lot to live up to.
Right. So, all right. Well, we'll see whether you can live up to that at some point. Okay. So, Steve.
Yeah.
Your book has a very exciting title, Can American Capitalism Survive? So the answer is?
Sure.
Okay. And does it have to do anything to change?
Yes, I think it probably does. I mean, it will survive, but whether we'll continue to be the richest country and have the most vibrant and innovative economy and to have the best social and legal and political institutions, that's not a given.
Okay, well, in your book you point out we have a lot of challenges now, and you point out there's income inequality, social mobility issues, and things like that. Why are there not riots in the streets? Why aren't people as upset about this as you think they should be after reading this book?
It's not so much that they would have read the book, but of course they would have experienced the sort of ruthless, unfair, unequal capitalism that we have. And why aren't they rioting in the streets? Well, it's probably not bad enough. First of all, it's America, and secondly, it's not bad enough. But I would say the election of Donald Trump is a pretty good indication that they're pretty unhappy with things, and they're willing to sort of lash out at the establishment and at the elite. So that's a pretty good indication that maybe we're not too far from it.
So you say American capitalism. What type of capitalism do you like better than American capitalism?
Well, like my students, I think Swedish capitalism is a little bit better, but Northern European capitalism is a little more humane, that provides a little more economic security, that's not so shareholder focused. They don't have as many financial crises as we do. They don't start financial crises. Of course, they're a smaller country.
But they have very, very high taxes.
Yes, they do.
And people move out of those countries to avoid those taxes, no?
Well, they used to, but the story you're telling is one that's really 30 years old, when they did have very high taxes, and they realized it was when Bjorn Borg, the tennis player, moved to Monaco or something like that in order to avoid taxes, and they reduced taxes. Their overall tax burden is around 50%. Our overall tax burden is around 35%, but they get a lot for that. For one thing, they get their health care, which, as you know, represents almost 18% of our economy, so 9% of that is private, so 9% of that 15 percentage point differential can be accounted for by healthcare. And they also get free childcare, they get mostly free education, including higher education.
Okay.
So they get more for that, and they seem to like that, which is not to say that we have to do the same, but that's where their politics and their culture and their history has taken them.
So those countries often have the highest happiness index. So our happiness index is
pretty low for the industrialized country, especially if you factor in that we're richer.
Okay. Well, Parag, let me ask you about Asia for a moment. Asia is, you say the future is Asian, but you point out in your book that the past was Asian as well, because Asia was more or less the center of the world for 1,000 years in terms of economy and so forth. Is that right?
Yeah, and I guess I could have called the book The Present is Asian also, because if you think about where we are in global demographics, half the world population is Asian today. 50% of global GDP in purchasing power parity terms is in Asia today. So it's past, present, and very much future as well, if you think about the growth rates, obviously.
So when did the West kind of take over Asia as at least the dominant political and military power and economic power in the world? When was that?
Well, you would say roughly the 16th century, you know, with the rise of European colonialism. And things could have turned out very differently. I'm not a historian, but there are two episodes that I look at that are real turning points in not only in world history, but in how Asians think about those episodes today and how it motivates them. One is when the Ming Dynasty had sent out its treasure fleets as far across the Indian Ocean as Africa, but then retreated in order to focus on domestic economic issues and sort of, you know, border skirmishes. And that allowed for the European colonial powers, particularly Portugal, to move into the Indian Ocean space. But imagine Vasco da Gama rounding the Cape of Good Hope and seeing Ming Dynasty fleets in the Indian Ocean. Just how successful would the, not only the Portuguese explorers, but the Dutch and British East India companies have been? And then there's the Ottoman sacking of Constantinople in the 1450s and how that motivated Europeans to look for alternate routes to Asia. So, you know, the lessons that Asians draw from those historical episodes that enable the rise of the West are that A, they should not retreat from their now political, commercial expansionism through Belt and Road and other sorts of things, and also that they should not be divided. They should not allow themselves to be divided and conquered. And they don't view Europe's success or the West's success as the product of great ingenuity, but rather of luck.
Okay, so the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, would that have been a good thing for the U.S. to keep our foot in Asia, or you think we've hurt ourselves by not moving forward with it?
Yeah, that's a major own goal. You know, I mean, economics is everything to Asians, right? Economic growth, maintaining economic growth, building their own economies, building their trade networks over the last 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And now with the rise of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Belt and Road, all of these acronyms that I'm throwing at you and that you see unfolding in real time in Asia are meant to integrate Asian economies. And for us, it would have been an enormous opportunity to sell more into Asia. And already every day we can see the data about American corporates declining market share in Asia. And what you're seeing perversely is that our exports may fall to countries like China as a result of the trade war. We will lose out to our own allies. Canada, Mexico, Japan, Australia, New Zealand are all actively have joined the TPP, even competing to lead it and to eat away at American market share. And then Asians will trade more with each other and we'll be left out.
Now, for those who aren't familiar with Belt and Road, what is that and where did that name come from?
So the Belt and Road Initiative is really a continuation of what's been happening over the last 25, 30 years in terms of this resurrection of the Silk Roads from the pre-colonial world, where again, Asians had much more to do with each other than with the rest of the world. Belt and Road is China's contribution to it, particularly in the last 5 to 10 years, but really I've been watching this over the last 20 years. They've been investing massively in cross-border railways, pipelines, highways. Now they call it a digital Silk Road with Huawei, fiber optic cables, and 5G. It is the infrastructural networking of Asia, and China is committed hundreds of billions of dollars to it. Others have as well. It's the bazooka of infrastructure.
Now, your definition of Asia is from where to where?
Well, it's funny, Isha, it's a real bugbear for me as a student of geography. There is only one definition of Asia, and Asia is not a continent. So our kids always learn the wrong thing, you know, which is that Asia is a continent, Europe is a continent. Actually, there's just one big continent called Eurasia. Europe shares it with Asia. They're two regions. But Asia, the Asian two-thirds of it, so the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea, all the way to the Sea of Japan, from Russia all the way to Singapore, including India, that is Asia. There's no dispute about what is Asia. The fact is, though, the last 10, 15, 20 years, we've been focused on Asia as if it's just China. And, you know, China represents all of Asia. And actually, China is only 1/3 of the Asian population. It's only about half of Asia's GDP. And now other Asian countries are actually growing faster than China. And much of what we call the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Israel, these countries are geographically in Asia. And more, they are gravitating towards the rest of Asia and away from the West economically and even strategically.
Okay. Steve, let me ask you, in your book,
Yeah.
you kind of make the 1970s, which I lived through and I worked in the White House, as a great time because you made it sound like people were happier then. Is that true?
Well, first of all, I would say the 1970s was a transition period, and it wasn't a great time, not because you were working in the White House. But in fact, and this is apropos of what Parag said, that it was during the 1970s that our economy began to become very uncompetitive for a whole variety of reasons. And it was as a result of that and as a reaction to that that we decided that, you know, Japan looked like they were going to take over, and Germany, and we were going to be left behind. We were going to be like Britain, a falling industrial power. And we really pulled up our socks and we made our capitalism leaner and meaner. And it worked. And we once again became the most competitive country in the world. So the 1970s was not a particularly good period. Now you say for workers. It was a pretty good period for workers, at least absent inflation. But the 1950s and the 60s are considered the golden era.
Okay, so in the 1980s, Reagan took over, Thatcher took over, and the concept of shareholder being the most important part of a corporation took over. Now the Business Roundtable has said, well, shareholders are not the only thing that CEOs and companies should worry about. What do you think about the Business Roundtable statement?
Well, I had a small, minor role in that, actually, but I would say the pendulum swung from too little regard for shareholders and profits to too much regard for shareholders and profits, and now, happily, the pendulum is swinging back. And the statement by the Roundtable was more a signal that the leaders of the biggest companies in the country understood that it had gone too far. And they would like a more balanced approach, which not like the 1970s, but more like the 1950s.
Income inequality is now as bad as it's been in the late 1920s. To what do you attribute our growing income inequality?
Technology, trade, deregulation, which happened during the 1970s when you were in the White House.
Well, they didn't listen to me.
They didn't. There you go. You know, there has been a natural tendency toward winner-take-all competition among companies and among workers. The top lawyers today get paid much more than the people slightly below them, the top professors, the top athletes, and also companies. The top companies make huge profits, Google, Facebook, compared to companies that are have almost as good products. So the winner-take-all quality, the lack of antitrust enforcement, it's a long list, but they're not all because of government, however, and I think this is a mistake people make. They think, oh, that's Reagan and Thatcher, and you know, obviously they play a role. But a lot of it has to do with norms of behavior. In the 1950s and 60s, a chief executive probably had the power over the board of directors to pay himself, it would have been a himself in those days, himself huge fees. They wouldn't have thought to do so. It would have been socially unacceptable. If they'd gone to the country club, another CEO would have said, hey, Joe, don't do that. It makes us all look bad. And anyway, you'll make Democrats of all of our workers. So they didn't do it in those days.
Okay, and you think that people were happier in the 1950s than they are today?
Yes, we know they were, actually.
Father knows best period of time is what,
Well, we do surveys of this. We ask people about their satisfaction with life, about satisfaction with their economic situation, and they were. They weren't richer, by the way.
But we're really
they only had one bathroom in the house. They had Formica countertops.
But the people who were happier were white, presumably, because minorities were sort of disenfranchised to a large extent in our economic system in the 50s and 40s, right?
Well, yes, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't happy. They had actually more vibrant communities than some of them have today. And it was built around their church and their communities. And to say that, you know, happiness, as you know, you know, people get happier, they get richer until they have incomes that are equivalent today to about $70,000. And then money and happiness, those lines start to depart. So people were happy, mostly because they had economic security. And this is something that I think the market people, the market fundamentalists don't understand. People assign a very high value to economic security. And we have a much less secure economy for middle class and working class people.
Well, some people say that economic security and happiness with your financial situation arises when you have exactly twice what you already have. In other words, you need twice what you have before you're actually financially secure, but that may be a different issue. So in terms of politics, you say in your book that the political contribution system in our country is really skewered towards wealthy people, and it's really making our economic system not so competitive. Is that right?
Well, I would say what I said about that was the following, that there are things we can do and should do, and if you want, we can talk about that in a policy sense to make our capitalism more palatable to people. But we can't do any of those things until we first change the political money situation.
But how would you change that? Because
constitutional amendment.
You need a constitutional amendment. But as you know, a constitutional amendment requires a constitutional convention or 2/3 of each house and 3/4 of the states. Is that realistic?
I think so. It's realistic if you think having a Democratic Congress and a Democratic president at the same time are realistic. I think there's a lot of support for an amendment that would allow a reasonable restriction on political money. And can we do something? Everyone who thinks that they would vote for that constitutional amendment, could you raise your hand? Okay. There's broad support for that idea. It's not considered a crazy idea.
But people who come to book festivals may not be a cross-section of America.
No, they're not. They're not. So they're older, they're richer, they're more liberal, and they live in Washington, D.C., or a lot of them do.
Okay.
So that's right. But
okay.
Polling has been done on this. There is broad support for that.
All right. And what about...
by the way, you know who's against that? Politicians of both parties right now are against it. Why? They've mastered the current system. They don't want to change it, so they're happy with the current system. We're the ones that are going to have to force it on them.
All right. Is there any other constitutional amendment you would recommend?
No.
That's the only one?
Yeah. I'll take that one.
All right. Is there any legislation that Congress could pass, not a constitutional amendment, that you think would bring us closer to what you would like us to have?
Well, there is. Some of it has to do with boring stuff like antitrust. The one I'm going to mention is a sort of twofer. I think that we should have a modest $3,000 per person universal basic income in the United States.
Yeah.
Some of that to replace some of the programs we have. And I wouldn't call it universal basic income. I'd call it a dividend for all citizens. And then I would pair that with required universal service. 3 years sometime during your life where you have to...
All right, how would you pay for that $3,000? Where would the money come from? Because we have a big debt already.
Right. Well, part of where I'd come from is I'd eliminate existing programs that we now have, and part of it I would raise money on people like me and you.
Higher taxes.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So you're not running for Congress, though, to do that, right? You're not.
You know something? I think if the Democrats should stop talking about how they're going to give a middle-class tax cut, because that's not what people want. They want good services. They want Social Security and Medicare and child care and good education, right. And they don't need a tax cut, and they don't want a tax cut. And I wish Democrats, and I'm a Democrat, you used to be a Democrat, I wish we would stop playing the tax cut game. No tax cuts, period.
Okay.
I guess maybe if I ran for Congress here, I'd be all right.
Now, Social Security system is more or less financially bankrupt. No?
Okay, well, it is not insolvent over a long period of time by a little amount. It could be made solvent very easily.
By increasing the taxes, or?
I would say you could do two things. One is you could very slowly raise the age. And secondly, you could subject all income to this payroll tax rather than only up to whatever it is, $225,000.
Okay. Parag, let me ask you this. Is Xi Jinping going to be in charge of China in our lifetime? Is he basically, like Putin, going to be president for life?
Well, I would strongly distinguish between Putin and Xi, because China actually has a governance system, an ethos, a set of institutions, a common, almost, bureaucratic tradition that goes back 4,000 years. Russia is an oligarchic authoritarian kleptocracy. So even though you have two leaders who appear as if they could rule for life, you have two very different systems underpinning that particular individual. Xi can technically rule now. They still, he abolished term limits, but there are still term structures. Whereas in Russia, Putin has been president and prime minister, and he can decide which portfolio is more important at any given time. So I can imagine a scenario where Xi Jinping steps down either after one more term, let's say, because he has a number of rings.
He's in his second term now.
Yeah, he is.
So
he could do one more, for example, and that would be unprecedented. But again, it is a finite period, and he has a set of people around him from which he can choose many.
All right, does Xi Jinping or the Chinese people, do they want a tariff agreement or a trade agreement with the United States, or do they really not want one?
Well, I mean, one of the hardest things to know is what the Chinese people think, other than what is mediated through their official spokesman. I do enough generalization in this book without trying to psychologically, sort of capture the sentiments of billions of people. But if I had to, the fact is that China's largest trading partner is its Asian neighbors, and its second largest trading partner outside of Asians is Europeans. We are actually its third most important trading partner, and that trade volume is now going down. So they actually are decoupling pretty significantly from the United States. We should be selling them more oil, more gas, more soybeans, more machinery, more tools, more technology. Instead, we're selling them less.
But do they want an agreement, you think, or not? You don't know.
Better to have one than not to have one, but it has to be one that isn't such a so disruptive to their supply chains.
Explain to us what's going on in Hong Kong now. Are the Chinese going to send troops in or not?
Well, technically the troops are there. Actually, the question is whether they release them, onto the streets, and the answer is they might. If you want to know the answer without knowing what's going to happen tomorrow, it still is this sort of death by 1,000 cuts strategy that began 21 years ago when the handover began. A few people realize this, but part of the agreement with the handover was that something on the order of 100 to 200 mainland Chinese families would be allowed to move into Hong Kong every day. So if you take 20 years and multiply it by that number of days, number of people, bottom line is there's more than 1 million mainland Chinese who have entered and now reside in Hong Kong over just the last 20 years, in addition to those that were there before. So you have a very divided polity, right? Clearly there is a certain Hong Kong ethos that we all know and love as a freewheeling society, certainly one that has, again, they have different passports. They have a Hong Kong British linked passport. So there is that kind of, Hong Kong identity that I strongly sympathize with, and we probably all do. But given the proximity, given the politics, given the legal handover, it's not likely that they're going to be able to be
in the 1970s, as Steve mentioned, we were worried in the United States that Japan was going to take over the world economically. What happened to Japan's economy? And its demographics are about the worst in the world. So what's going to happen to Japan over the next 10, 20, and 30 years?
Mm-hmm. So just as an aside, it was wrong to believe that Japan was going to take over the world, and it doesn't mean that we are equally wrong to view China as a major, peer competitor, because they're two very, very different countries. Obviously, China vastly larger demographically and now economically. When it comes to Japan, yes, they are in demographic decline. However, we've kind of, I think we need a new conversation about Japan that doesn't really judge the country solely on the basis of the fact that their population is decreasing. For one thing, they're the most evolved technological society in the world. So they are moving towards this kind of man-machine, sort of synthesis like no other place in the world. They have robots deployed just about everywhere, in restaurants, in hotels, and so on. Then they are actually significantly revising their immigration policies. So there have never been, in the history of Japan, 2 million non-Japanese people living on the 4 main Japanese islands. That you have today. Half of them are actually Chinese. You've got, on top of that, 700,000 Koreans, 300,000 Vietnamese, 50,000 Indians. So you've got literally several million and counting and growing foreigners. So Japan is the last place on earth we would ever think of as an immigrant society and a melting pot. And it's not going to be, but they are drastically changing their immigration policy to fill labor shortages.
What about North Korea? Is Kim Jong-un going to survive, and is there going to be an agreement with him?
I think there will be some kind of agreement with him. It's already been, underway. I think, what Trump did.
What kind of agreement? They wouldn't remove their existing nuclear power.
No, I think you go through stages of creating like a condominium. I mean, Japan, remember that China and South Korea generally agree on what they want to see happen in the country that's between them. Those two countries have a lot more influence over North Korea than we do. I think that Trump's summit helped to kick off or maybe amplify a certain dynamic, but ultimately we are not as decisive.
Who writes these love letters that he's sending to President Trump? What is in those letters?
I'm not sure I would hire him for any particular purpose, but I don't, I don't know, but he could have his own cottage industry at some point. But this is a place that is already economically, to the extent that it has an economy that's already colonized in some ways by China and South Korea. And those countries have strong interests in extracting the resources there and using the agriculture and the low-cost labor force. And they're going to continue to do that.
The chance of the North Korean government being overthrown internally, that's zero?
Close to zero.
Okay. And finally on this subject, India. Is India going to be growing at a faster pace than China?
Well, the thing that's surprising that India and China have in common, despite their very different political systems and societies, is that they both lie about their numbers. They're so flagrant, it's unbearable. So you don't know what to believe when it comes to Indian economic statistics either. But the closer you look at it, the more you have to revise it downward, which is an unfortunate consequence to some degree of being the chaotic, democratic, place that India is. So forget the growth rate. They've got structural problems around unemployment, the risk of labor automation, the lack of, there is no real labor productivity, and of course climate change and the sort of desertification and the water shortages. So they've got big structural problems there.
All right, Steve, as I mentioned, you won the Pulitzer Prize for your commentary on what happened in the financial crisis. Do you see any similarity to what you wrote about then now? And do you think we're heading into a big financial crisis again?
Yes, there's some similarity, and I think we are heading into one that's not so big. The previous one had a lot to do with consumer debt, not only home debt, mortgages, but cars and college loans. I think this one is mostly in the business sector, and there's a lot of debt that has been taken out, not all of which has been productively used. And if there is a slowdown, that will come home to roost. And
the recession starting when, would you say? Predictions or?
Actually, our basic economy is in pretty good shape. And so there is this divergence between the financial sector and the real economy. And if you look at all the recent recessions since 1987, they have been caused by perturbations in the financial market. In other words, they've not been the normal ups and downs of an industrial economy that we had in the 1950s and 60s. These are financially driven recessions. So I think it starts in finance, and then that tends to bring down the economy.
And you wrote about the last financial crisis. Who was the greatest hero? Was it Ben Bernanke, Hank Paulson, Tim Geithner, President Bush, the Congress? Who do you think deserves the most credit for actually helping us get out of that mess?
I would say it's Hank Paulson.
Right? Because?
Because it was a lot harder for a Republican Treasury Secretary in the Bush administration, who had been at Goldman Sachs, to get the country to agree to something very unpalatable, that you had to help the institutions. You had to prevent the meltdown of the institutions that caused the problem in order to prevent a worse outcome for everybody else.
Now, many people today will say they're for the free enterprise system, politicians, but they don't like to say they're capitalists. Why is the word capitalist such a offensive thing to people?
I don't know. I see it in my students at George Mason University, but it conjures up a sort of moral distaste. And again, that goes to the ruthlessness and the inequality and the unfairness that they see. They're not socialists, though. If you ask them, first of all, they don't really know what socialism is, but they're not for the government controlling everything and owning everything. They're certainly not for that. So, you know, my students, I ask them, well, how many of you want to go work for government? And I think you and I would both be very unhappy to know that I never get anyone to put their hand up.
Really?
And then I say, would you like to go work for a big business? How many would like to do that? And nobody puts their hands up. I say, well, who wants to go work at Goldman Sachs? Maybe one person will put their hand up, and rather sheepishly. I said, so what do you all want to do?
What about private equity? You don't ask about that.
I didn't. I'm not sure they know. But I would recommend that they do. But where they want to work at NGOs, non-governmental organizations. They want to work at startups, which they somehow think isn't part of capitalism.
Or that startups all become unicorns.
Right. Well, it's not that they want to get rich. They think that those kinds of companies don't have this sort of moral stain on them.
So how long have you been teaching at George Mason?
8 years.
All right, so 8 years ago, were the students different than they are today?
Not much, no.
And they just, the biggest question is this going to be on the exam? Is that what they always ask? That's what I always ask.
No, I tend not to give exams, and I also tell them that grades are like sex. The more you worry about them and focus on them, the less well you'll do.
Is that from experience or observation?
Observation.
Observation, not experience. Okay. Okay, so the most popular export from China is the panda bear. As you know, we have 2 in the zoo here. Why are the pandas used by the Chinese as tools of diplomacy? Why don't they just give them to lots of people?
Well, it's a supply and demand. There's actually a limited supply. You know, just like we're trying to save the northern white rhino right now, they're in a constant effort to, you know, breed pandas and get them to breed. They're rather slothful creatures, as you may know. Not as energetic as Steve's students, I imagine. But I'm not sure what the exact origins or, you know, earliest date of panda diplomacy is. I think that it's just a reminder that a lot of Chinese diplomacy is symbolism, right? And you have to really differentiate between, you know, the rhetoric of fraternity and so forth versus the reality, which is much more capitalist and neo-mercantilist than anything else.
So let's talk about Australia. How is Australia? Is Australia part of Asia?
It is, yeah. I mean, it's not tectonically part of Asia, but it very much is, you know, geographically. And when you think about their economy as well, it's you know, it's a giant iron ore mine that's hitched itself to China, and they realize that, and so they're in a desperate quest to diversify their export destinations, to make more of you know, other sectors of their economy like education and healthcare, real estate. They are today the largest net per capita recipient of high net worth individuals in the world because they have this fairly transparent immigration policy, and you've got Japanese, Koreans, and obviously plane loads of Chinese that are buying real estate in Australia, moving there, taking Australian citizenship. Under the age of, I guess, you know, 30, 35, there is a much faster growth rate of the Asian population of Australia than the white population. So it is becoming Asian in many, many ways.
Why did the Chinese government want to build islands in the South China Sea? What are they for, tourism or what?
Yes, a tourism in which you get to fly an F-16. That's my kind of tourism. So the island fortifications in the South China Sea go back to the fact that it's a legal gray area, right? These are islands that have passed hands and control over centuries, and China wants to use the fact that there is no clear de jure demarcation to simply build facts in the water. You know, if you can, once China claims something and starts to build, you know, dredge sand and put airstrips there and put military assets, it basically controls it. You're never going to get them through arbitration or otherwise to give it back. So they're on this island building spree, and now other countries are starting to do the same thing and basically claim whatever they can close to their shores. The Philippines is doing it. We're helping the Philippines do it. Vietnam is doing it. Eventually, they will have a de facto settlement, even though they will have a de jure disagreement.
How's Vietnam doing economically?
Vietnam is an amazing growth story. It's one of the countries that, you know, when I first went more than 15 years ago and wrote very positive things about its incredible, you know, potential, I even underestimated it then. And you go there today and you not only see that with 100 million people, they are, you know, they remain, you know, coherent, organized. They don't have these teeming, uncontrolled, polluted megacities like Jakarta or Manila. Ho Chi Minh City is an impeccably, you know, organized place of 20, 25 million people. So this is a disciplined country. They're urbanizing rapidly. They're very young, very hardworking. There's a lot of high-tech supply chains, not just cheap manufacturing stuff in special economic zones, but Samsung and lots of others are starting to do more business.
Because of our trade disagreement right now with China, is it the case that you observe companies are moving their manufacturing out of China to places like Vietnam? Is that happening?
It's definitely happening, but, you know, and I want us to get our facts and our sequencing correct so that 5, 10 years from now, we don't look back and say the trade war is what caused American firms to shift their supply chains out of China. Wrong. China's wages were rising before the trade war began. Japan began massively shifting FDI out of China into Southeast Asia 10 years ago, way before the trade war, way before Trump. So the trade war is only accelerating something that was already happening, and it's great for Southeast Asia.
And what about Russia and its Asia ambitions? Is Russia an Asian power now? Or
so, you know, Russia is geographically very much Asian. It's a big resource provider to Asia. Russia is becoming more relevant to Asia, but that doesn't mean it's as influential in Asia as China or other countries like Japan. You know, they view it as a rear kind of resource base. Again, it's, you know, it's oil and gas, it's timber, it's agriculture. So Russia now has, I think it was during the Obama administration actually when, you know, this phrase pivot to Asia was coined, and Putin said something like, well, we pivoted to Asia a long time ago, you know, and Russia has, you know, constant diplomacy with China. According to the, there's an index that Peking University maintains around a country's compliance with the Belt and Road Initiative. Russia ranks #1. You know, pretty much anything China wants in terms of modernize these railways, build this highway, allow us to transit goods through your country to Europe, Russia does it.
And all these Belt and Road things that have been built by China in the Silk Road area, it is said that there's a lot of debt that has accrued. In other words, they don't give these roads, they kind of finance them. But is that debt going to be paid back, or are the Chinese just going to walk away from it?
It depends. There's a wide spectrum of possibilities. There are write-downs and projects that never see the light of day. They're the white elephants, just like you would expect in any country with large infrastructure projects going on. Then there's cases where countries are very strategic, and even though the debt is high and those countries can't repay, those countries are so important to China that China will forgive the debt and reduce the volume of, like Pakistan. And then there's cases in between where China is going to switch from concessional to non-concessional, which is a fancy way of saying really ramping up the interest rates to punish those countries and seize assets. Right. All of the above.
Do I need to worry about a Pakistan-India nuclear problem?
No. I mean, you know, for better or worse, you know, this is something where Modi moved in a way preemptively to de facto settle something that was already in some ways settled.
Did the Pakistan government know that Osama bin Laden was living in Pakistan?
It depends on who you mean by government. I leave it at that.
Okay. All right, the most important question. If I have some money to invest, and I want to invest in Asia...
He does.
But yeah, it's purely hypothetical.
What country should I invest in first, and second, and what country should I avoid?
So remember that Southeast Asian countries are small. You would invest in an asset class, you'd invest in an industry, because they're all cross-border supply chains now. You would invest in e-commerce, for example, where you'd look at you know, e-commerce conglomerates that are headquartered in Singapore, but Singapore is a tiny country, but they're operating everywhere. So you'd be looking at the rise of automotive manufacturing, you'd invest in that. You'd be looking at mobile phone production, you'd be looking at healthcare, and financial services and fintech, all the digital stuff. You would invest in those things, not in a country, but in the region.
Okay. So, where are you investing?
Well, I live in Singapore, But
and we didn't talk about Singapore. Why is Singapore always pretty prosperous and a happy place?
It wasn't always, I mean, I think...
Well, it's since, let's say, in the last 20 years.
I mean, even superficially, as people know the story, it actually had a very rough start as a former British colony and then ejected from Malaysia against its own will, really, in the 1960s. So it's only in the country's technically 54 years old, formally, and it's become incredibly wealthy. It's obviously very much a free trade-driven model, a foreign investment-driven model, an open immigration model, education-focused, talent-driven model, very good government, low corruption. It's basically ticked a lot of boxes.
Who's the most popular American president in recent years in Asia?
Oh, it's obviously Obama.
Okay.
Yeah, no question. He's still very popular. He does go to Asia, maybe once, twice a year.
Who's the most popular American cultural figure in Asia?
Oh, that's a good question. I couldn't say it was necessarily one. I mean, the answer in China, would be different than somewhere else.
Okay.
It could be basketball players.
Well, okay. Steve.
A musician.
All right. So the chances of our country doing what you want us to do is 50%, 100%, 0%. In other words, you have a lot of structural changes you want us to make, or legislative changes. You think these are going to happen or not?
The things that I cite specifically are actually, I think, fairly modest. I mean, there are lefties who think I'm a wuss. I mean, I disagree with Elizabeth Warren on almost everything. So
you're against the wealth tax?
Yes, actually. So I'm not really that radical, and the chances, I think the chances of us not improving antitrust, the chances of us not raising taxes on wealthy people, the chances of us not dealing with political money are actually pretty low. As bad as our political system is today, it's still reasonably responsive to what people want, and it's pretty clear what people want, which is they want a more humane and moral capitalism.
All right, so we've given people a little bit of a tease of this book, Can American Capitalism Survive? Why should somebody go and buy this book and now read it after you've already told them what's in it?
Because it makes a fairly it's a book in some ways about ideas and about how we glommed onto some very bad ideas. Greed is good. That all that matters is equality of opportunity, not income. That if we become more fair, that our economy will shrink. We glommed onto those ideas. They became widely accepted. And this book explains why, in fact, they're not right.
When you won the Pulitzer Prize, when they call you up, were you surprised, or you said, I deserved it for a long time? What was your reaction when you won it?
I'm one of the few people who ever won a Pulitzer Prize who was not nominated by his newspaper or her newspaper.
Who nominated you?
An individual. Back in those days, anyone could nominate anybody. And so it was a little surprising to the editors of the Washington Post when I won.
So what did you say to them? What did you say to them? See, I don't need you. Is that what you said?
I didn't say anything.
Okay.
I didn't need to.
Okay. So why should somebody, after hearing this about your book, why should somebody go buy this book and read this book, The Future is Asian?
Well, we haven't even scratched the surface. That's one reason. There's a lot more in there. But if you want to understand what 5 billion people think and what they're doing right now, and how, to put it bluntly, they don't really care what we think about them, I think there's a lot of learning that we all have to do as Americans about this vast majority of the world population.
Okay. And so, how long did it take you to write this book?
A couple of years.
How long did it take you to write this book?
Well, it had a false start. But once I got working on it by myself and not with a previous co-author, it went pretty fast. The writing isn't hard for me, but...
Okay. Well, I've read both of them. I enjoyed them, and I hope people will have a chance to read these books. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.